Hello?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Lucy. I can hear you now. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yes, I realised it was muted. So.
It's one of these things. There's so many things to think about.
I know, absolutely. Right, let's see. Is this showing correctly?
I can see it. It's gone full screen.
Oh, fantastic.
Looks good.
Brilliant. So that'll be the landing screen.
Excellent. You all set?
Yes. I'm feeling really anxious about it. I'm not sure. I mean, I've done presentations several times. But, my husband broke his arm yesterday evening.
Oh, no.
Shoulder. So I was in A&E with him till 2 a.m.
Oh, God.
So I think I'm just probably a little bit overwhelmed in general. He's gone to work today because he's an idiot.
Oh. Is it a bad break or a crack? Or
yeah, he's cracked right through part of his shoulder.
Oh, no.
So he's in a sling. He's got the fracture clinic tomorrow morning. But I said, take the day off. And he said, oh, but I've got a student who really needs support, so I better go in. He's a lecturer, so.
Right. But I presume he can't drive or anything like that?
No, he can't. He's had to go on the tram. He was so funny. Last night, he said, it's okay. I'll go by myself and I can go home on the bus. I was like, really, David? Really? Are you sure? I had to help him get undressed. It's his right arm as well. He's right-handed, so could be better.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, he's all in a sling, but obviously feeling a bit flustered from that and didn't get a lot of sleep. So.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah,
I was just like perfect timing, and I've got a cold as well. So.
Well, it doesn't sound too bad, to be honest.
Excellent. Yeah, I've got several tissues around me, so if I do, it seems to be okay most of the time, but every so often there's just a big sneeze and something that is unavoidable.
I'm just printing out the list because I haven't found a good way of tracking who's joined. I don't know. How often do you use this? Or have you said you've got techies who are helping you?
Yes, it's usually Mia and Jane who set everything up and run it. So all I do is get handed the presenting part.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll just try and print this because I mean, basically, I've got the list of everybody who signed up, but we're now up to 99.
Yeah.
100 if you count me. But it's quite hard to figure out who's joined and who hasn't.
Yes.
They appear alphabetically, and there's no notion of somebody's just arrived, or although I have turned a ping on at the moment. But anyway, so I've got that printed off. It's very small because I put it on one page. And then I've got you. So I can shrink that. I'm just shrinking down my windows. So I've got you in front. I've got the recording option good to go. I've got a poll already open. What I'd like to do is start the poll at the beginning. I've rewritten the poll, so
okay, that's absolutely fine. I didn't have him inputting the questions into it, so I really don't want to focus on.
No. Well, I mean, basically, last time we did a very successful poll asking about membership status.
Okay.
And it was quite interesting that not everybody was a member, because we're having this debate as to whether we should keep them open or not.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we got some useful data, and then Mia and that said, well, actually, we'd like to do some evaluation questions, which again, we haven't really done.
Yeah.
So then Mia, I think, loaded those up, and then I realised that would launch first. So I had to delete hers, copy the questions, and redo it so that the membership one comes up first. But as soon as we move on to the live thing, then I'll open it and put it on the chat. So at the moment we're still in practice mode. So,
yes, that's perfect for me.
Yeah, and
so I just want to confirm. Last time I thought you said that most people spoke for 15, as in 15 minutes. But
no,
I think
50.
you actually 50, because that's why I said, oh my goodness, I think I'm going to struggle with that.
Right.
Because I thought I'm not going to cram this into 15 minutes.
No.
And afterwards I realised, hang on, when she was saying, oh, you know, it's good, you could argue that it's more bite-sized. I thought, hang on, but that's longer than 50.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm all for bite-sized learning, but that's ridiculous.
Yes. I know. I thought, wow, that's very short. So I was thinking.
What? I'm sorry about that. But what I was
minutes. So I was thinking.
John Curran did the last one, and he said, "Oh, this is normally just half an hour," but actually, he quite easily spoke for 50, 55. We haven't had huge numbers of questions.
Yeah.
But no, it's just the thing is, it's all one. It's a bit one way, because they're all muted when they join, obviously, because there's a lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're saying to them, use the chat if you want to ask questions. But we've had good feedback. I mean, one person said it was really, really useful last time. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I don't think I'll speak for 50, but I'm probably be hitting at least 30. Usually I'm told I need to make it shorter. So, but yes, I was very concerned when I thought you said 15. So I thought, this is a lot to cover.
So I mean, really, well, I'll start the recording at 12 when we start properly. I'll probably open it up in the next minute or so.
Yeah.
Into broadcast mode. But as I say, you've got the perfect title and argument for saying I'm not going to overload you.
Yes, well, absolutely. Although, as you'll see later, we don't just want to talk about cognitive overload. We also need to talk about cognitive underload. I need to teach them some new things. So.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So, yeah.
I hope you enjoy it. I think it's a really interesting. I mean, obviously, I personally think it's a very interesting topic. So are you going to do an introduction, or what exactly?
I will do a very, very brief one. I'll just say, right, we're now recording, and I'd like to introduce you.
Okay, perfect.
Literally, that's all I'll do. So if you want to introduce yourself and say, what you do at Walkgrove.
Yep.
And maybe even a little bit, I don't know, have you said anything about how you got into this whole area?
No, I'm actually doing a PhD. So this is based on an academic paper that I wrote as part of that, which I then converted into a white paper for Walkgrove. So there's in fact a related white paper on Walkgrove's website that talks about.
Okay. Have you got the links to that?
Oh, I haven't. I never get, because I work remotely, so I don't get all the stuff.
Do you want me to have a look for it? Will it be on their website?
Yeah, hang on. Let me just bring this up. You're going to see. Please move this window away from the shared application. I've done a few white papers.
Where are you doing your PhD?
Lancaster.
Oh, I did my master's there.
Oh, lovely.
Long time ago, 2004, in management learning and leadership. So
oh, very nice.
I've actually found a PDF link, cognitive theory.
That's probably it then.
I shall, I'll keep that open, and then I can drop it in. I won't drop it in right away.
Yeah.
But, okay, are we ready to go live? Are you happy for me to open it up?
Yes, absolutely.
We can still keep chatting. So
yep.
it just means people can start to join.
Absolutely. Hang on, I'll quit Skype.
And I'll launch the
so that
poll.
nobody, and I'll shut down my email so I don't get things pinging up on screen. Well,
Yeah, I've done, I've done that.
It's a number of times that happens. Phone calls at awkward times.
Oh, I haven't taken the phone out. I'm just going to take the phone out of my room.
Good plan.
Even if you just move the phone, the base unit's still ringing.
Yes.
I'm quite pleased with the popularity of these. We've got 5 people signed in already. Let's see who we've got. So welcome everybody who's joining. I'm afraid you are muted because we're expecting potentially 100 people. So we'll start at 12 o'clock prompt. Lucy's already online.
Hi there.
And if you wouldn't mind filling in the little poll at the start, then we can just track membership. We've got a little poll at the end to enable you to give us some feedback. And we've got a few people coming back for a second or third time, so that's good news too.
This is my first time being involved with the eLearning network, so I'm quite excited about this. I've run this presentation a few times as a webinar and also in industry events, so hopefully it'll run smoothly.
I'm sure it'll be fine. I give up. I've made the print out of the list too small, so I can't read it. having to go back to the spreadsheet. It's quite tricky trying to track everybody who's joined. Is that message from Rachel? Thanks, Rachel. I hope you got the links to the previous recordings that we've done. I should warn those who've joined already, I should warn you, there's a little bit of a glitch with Zoom that we can't quite get to the bottom of, in that some people like Rachel can chat to all panelists and attendees, whereas Alan is only able to chat to panelists, which is effectively myself and Lucy. So what we'll do is I'll keep an eye on the chat while Lucy's doing her presentation, and then I'll copy stuff across that's interesting. Alan says, a day without challenge is not worth getting out of bed for. Are you seeing this as a challenge, Alan? Lucy, you said you were feeling a little bit challenged, but hey.
Yes. Yes, I didn't get a huge amount of sleep last night because my husband, while playing squash, ran into a wall and has broken his shoulder. So we were up in AOE into the early hours. So I did not get as much sleep as I would have liked before this starts.
Poor thing.
So that's my challenge for the day. Particularly because we've ordered a skip. We were planning to strip out the bedroom and do some painting and decorating this weekend.
I don't think he'll be doing much of that.
No longer going to be helping with that. I've already paid for the skip, so I'll just be doing it. He'll be overseeing me.
Well, he could do things one-handed, maybe.
It's unfortunately his left hand that is available, and he's right-handed. So again,
yeah, lifting the odd thing with your left hand.
Yes.
I hope you've got lots of friends and family around to help.
Well, he injured himself playing squash with other mathematicians. He's a lecturer at the University of Nottingham, and so we have several mathematicians who have offered to come and help me strip out the bedroom, which is very kind.
Very good. Yeah. Hopefully
we will get it all done.
Yeah. Alan has commented that, Lucy, you're amongst friends. Where is your skip? He could fill it easily.
Yes, well, I'm up in Nottingham, so if you're local, we are getting a big skip. There may be room. You never know.
Do we have anybody from Nottingham? Okay, well, it's good to know that the chat function is being used. I'm just about to turn on the recording, and then I'll officially introduce the webinar. So I think we're now recording, I hope so. I'd like to introduce Lucy Hodge from Waltgrove, who's doing today's webinar for us. And quickly thank everybody who's filled in the opening poll. But that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to hand straight over to Lucy and say welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this for us.
Thank you ever so much, Joan. I'm very excited to be involved in this. So my name's Lucy Hodge, and I am a senior instructional designer and solutions consultant with Waltgrove. And I'm very interested in learning theories behind cognitive behaviours. I'm actually working towards a PhD in technology enhanced learning, and so some of my interest in this area on cognitive load came out from one of the papers that I actually wrote during my PhD. And I have an adapted, slightly more layman's form of it available on Waltgrove's website, freely available, that is related to this presentation. It provides you with more information and more detail. So if you do listen to this and think, oh, this does sound quite interesting, then please go on Waltgrove's website. You'll be able to find it quite easily, I do believe, I hope. And please download that. And that will also give you some more academic references or books that you might be interested in going to read, which obviously I won't be mentioning in passing, but they are very good resources that tell you a lot about cognitive load from a more academic perspective. So this is aimed more at lay people because I know that not everybody will be particularly familiar with this. But as always, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and Joan will pick some of those up, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them. If they're things that need to be answered on the spot, Joan, please interrupt me as I keep waffling on, and I'll pick those up. Otherwise, at the end, there'll be an opportunity for more questions. Okay, so in this chat, I'll be talking about managing cognitive load. You may or may not have heard of cognitive load. So the different topics that we'll be going through a brief introduction where I explain what it is. Then we'll have a quick look at cognitive load theory, what it is and why it's relevant to us as learning designers and people working in the L&D sphere. To understand that, we need to know, how does our brain work? Or at least a model of how our brain works. So there are some key assumptions that we make that are based on evidence that give us an idea of how our brain works and why that's the underpinning for cognitive load theory. We'll then talk about different types of load, because cognitive load is not just one thing. There are in fact 3 types of load that we need to look at. Then we'll be looking at how to manage the load, considering both cognitive overload and cognitive underload. This, I think, is an area that can be really important to learning designers, because while we frequently will talk about cognitive overload, cognitive underload is something that perhaps is not considered as much as it should be. After that, I'll just have a very brief summary and we'll get on to some questions. Okay, so can I confirm, can everybody see the screen? I think we've got a comment from Jill that you can see the poll, but you can't see anything apart. Oh, you can't see the poll. Joan, is that something you could pick up?
Yes, don't worry about the poll. Just concentrate. As long as you can see the screen, that's the main thing now.
Okay, fantastic. Right, so introducing cognitive load and what it is. So you all probably know that we can recall a lot of existing knowledge. So when people ask you questions, it's an area that you know the answer to, you can usually tell them. Sometimes you might struggle to immediately recall, but we've got an awful lot of knowledge in our brains, whether it's locations, directions, maps, processes, people's names and faces, languages, music. Our brain can hold an awful lot of stuff. However, we really struggle with processing new information. There was a really interesting paper that was written by George Miller in 1956. It's quite an accessible paper and it's called 7 ± 2. The idea there is that actually when you're presented with new pieces of information, on average, you can't recall more than 7 items in a row. How that was done was by looking at numbers and unique pieces of information, and where people were challenged to try and remember as many as they could. And in fact, most people could only remember the first 7 things, and then beyond that, they really struggled. Processing slowed, and they found it very difficult. Of course, you know, there are people who have trained themselves and come up with many techniques in which they can remember the order of a whole deck of cards. Most people, and the layman, people like myself, can't do that. We can manage maybe 7 bits of information, sometimes 9, sometimes 5, depending on who we are and the circumstances. But essentially, what that led to was the idea of cognitive load. Why is it that we've got all this information in our brains that we can remember far more than 7 pieces of information, but if we're looking at something new, we can't process that? So the idea is, in fact, with cognitive load, that there's too much burden by presenting new information. That part of our brain can't process it as quickly as the longer term memory. So we'll be looking at task processing and our working memory. Now, when we talk about too much load, if you've got more than 7 new pieces of information, you might struggle to remember any of them. As you've gone further and further down that deck of cards, you might forget the ones right at the start. So we know that too much load is a problem. It means that we can struggle to remember things. However, sometimes you don't have enough load. So what happens when we have less load than is necessary. And that's something that's really quite interesting, particularly for people in the L&D sphere, to say, okay, if we're not giving people enough information, if there's not too much load, what does that really mean? So cognitive load theory, what is it and why is it relevant? What's really important to say up front is that CLT, that's cognitive load theory, is evidence-based. So there have been lots and lots of empirical studies that have looked at how people process information, and it's based primarily in educational and cognitive psychology with a look at information processing. As we know, you can remember a lot of things that you already know, but if you're getting something new, it's the processing that's the problem. Now, the theory was really developed to help teach complex problems. And again, this is one of those questions where you look and say, well, is that relevant to me? What's going on? Can we apply this to other subject matter areas? And the answer is yes, we can, but we need to think about this carefully. It's fantastic when we're looking at breaking down really complex topics. We also need to think about how we might do things when things aren't quite as challenging. So it's a very practical theory. When we say cognitive load theory, really the theory is just there is such a thing as cognitive load and we need to manage it. But beyond that, it goes into practical recommendations for what you need to do to actually manage that load. So it's very much practical. It's not just a theory. And so in this talk, we'll be looking at ways in which we really can reduce that cognitive load, because that's one of the key things, particularly when you're looking at something quite complex. Now, it's a very influential theory. Even if you haven't heard of cognitive load per se, you've probably heard of things like chunking, making sure you don't overload the learner. That's all based on the theory of cognitive load, and different techniques that can be used to mitigate that and break it up. So even if you haven't come across it yet or don't know you've come across it, it's something you'll probably see in the future. So it is a very important and timely topic, I think. So with cognitive load theory, what's important to note is we have to make some assumptions about how our brain works. Again, as I said, it's very much an evidence-based theory. So there have been lots of empirical studies that have been done on different types of processing, different types of information. So there is a good body of evidence to show this. But of course, you have to make certain assumptions because we can only predict how the brain is working because of the evidence that we've seen. So the way in which we look at our brain with cognitive load theory is that we split it into 3 different types. There's working memory. Now that's the limited memory. That's the memory where you only have the ability to process 7 pieces of new information. So that's very limited when you're dealing with that new information. But interestingly, it's not limited when we look at schemas, which I'll come on to in a little bit of time. Long-term memory, that's what we think about generally when we're talking about memory. Our ability to access information that we've stored in our brain for years and years and years now. It's almost indefinite, almost unlimited. So essentially, nobody has come up with a way to sort of fill your long-term memory. There might be issues with processing breakdown, so you know something and it's in the back of your mind, you're thinking about it, it's on the tip of your tongue, but in fact it is there in your memory, you're just struggling to access it. So with the long-term memory, that seems to basically be unlimited. What's really interesting is looking at schemas. Now this is something you may well not have heard of before. So schemas, as I'm saying here, they're mental constructs that help us understand and categorize information quickly and effectively. They're essentially blueprints, so things that we use for pattern recognition. So for example, if you play a lot of games, you'll learn the rules quickly, but you'll also learn techniques, you'll learn formations, ways in which you need to move, ways in which you need to play. Perhaps, for example, you're a chess player. There are lots of different chess openings that you will create schemas for, these mental constructs that show in your mind where pieces need to be moved. And as you become more and more proficient in these things, your brain builds up more and more schemas. It's the same with remembering directions when you remember a route. It's the same with remembering a recipe. It's the same with learning to read. These are all schemas. These are all mental constructs. So when you're starting off, it can be quite difficult for you to build them up. but over time, you'll learn pattern recognition. And that's what schemas do. They help you recognize patterns. What these patterns do is let us take that new information in, those elements that are in our working memory, and place them within this schema. And that's essentially what people who do those memory tricks are doing. They've got these schemas, ways to build up to recognize this information. So they can place the new limited memory across from that. So when they get that new information in, they apply it to their schemas and they're able to actually work out and process that memory. So schemas are really important. And as I said, then the working memory is not limited when you come to schemas. There's something that's kind of in our long-term memory that we then apply and use with our working memory for recognition. So they help us process that new information and mean that we can actually move that into our long-term memory storage, but it doesn't limit that mental sorry, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold as well. It doesn't limit that mental processing of working memory. And that's really, really important when we're looking at cognitive load, because of course, what we're looking at here specifically is working memory. So I've said that there are different types of load with cognitive load. So as we know, cognitive load, what that is the inherent burden that's on our working memory and processing ability. So this is broken down into 3 different types of load. That's intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. Of those, the ones that you need to pay most attention to are intrinsic load and extraneous load. So the intrinsic load, as the name suggests, is load that is inherent in the content or task. So for example, if you're doing some further maths work, that will probably have a high level of intrinsic cognitive load because it's something that's quite complex and requires quite a lot of working memory to process it. So that's your intrinsic load. Whereas, however, if you're a competent reader and you look at something, it's the letters of the alphabet, that's got a very low level of intrinsic load. You kind of already know that. That's not difficult. That won't take a lot of working memory to process at all. You don't need to draw on a lot of schemas. It's not really new information. So that's what you need to look at with intrinsic load. How difficult is the material? Is it very easy, or is it something that's really quite complex and challenging? That's very important when we're looking both at cognitive overload and cognitive underload. Unfortunately, we can't really control intrinsic load. It's either difficult or it isn't. Although it's important to note that something that's difficult for one target audience might not be as difficult for another. So, for example, my husband is a mathematics lecturer, and if he's faced with some mathematical problems that I would consider to be incredibly difficult and have a very high intrinsic load, he won't find them as challenging. So for him, the difficulty is lower than it is for me. So the way in which he's taught something or needs to look at something is different to the way in which I need to be taught or learn it. And that's something that's very important to bear in mind and something that we'll be looking at. So extraneous load, this is the load that we can control. Essentially, what we need to do as learning and design professionals is to look at the content and look at how we can present it in the best fashion. So extraneous load is load that's been introduced by us, the learning designers, or people who are presenting the information or presenting the context. So that's what extraneous load is. That's something that we can avoid. We can look at things and say, well, actually, how can we avoid presenting any extraneous load on here? Or at least that's true for the case of cognitive overload. We actually need to do something different for cognitive underload, but that's something that we'll look at in a minute. So germane load, not really very important. That's just the load that we need to construct schemas. So we need something there for us to be able to create these frameworks, to construct these schemas. Otherwise, we can't actually process everything. So there does need to be some load, but that germane load's important. We can't really control it. It's essential anyway, so we don't need to think about it. Essentially, if you add these 3 types of load up, the intrinsic load, the extraneous load, and the germane load, you get the total cognitive load. And that's what's really important. What you therefore need to do is look at that equation and say, well, is that more than the working memory processing capacity, or is it less than it is? And say, okay, is that good or bad? Now, it's very difficult to know, you know, what is the working memory processing capacity for a person? How do we know how much is intrinsic and how much is extraneous? And that's a really good question. And that's something that really you learn over time, and you're able to learn through some techniques. So that's something that should work as you learn a little bit more about cognitive load and what you need to look at so that you can actually manage it. Okay, first I'd like to say, does anybody have any questions so far, or has this all been quite clear?
Quick question from me, Lucy.
Yes, absolutely.
If you've already got a schema in your head, does that, I mean, you're saying that the germane load is not that critical, but does it help with the cognitive load if actually you can kind of map new stuff onto your existing schemas? Or
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why some things are more difficult for some people than other people. So, for example, a novice has no schemas already. You'll need to take things more slowly for them. The cognitive load in a new task will be higher for them because they don't have these schemas already. What we need to do is present them with the information in such a way that schema development is really easy and straightforward. And a good way. So we need to make sure that we don't present things in a really confusing fashion. So presenting things logically with clear examples is one of the best ways to enable people to actually create schemas in their minds. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. And Rachel's got a question. Would something like an analogy be classed as a schema?
Yes, it absolutely could be. Yes. Because again, once you understand that this relates to that other thing, then very much that could be a schema. So yes, something like an analogy, very much. Okay, and another comment, presumably the processing capacity can vary from day to day and over life. That's absolutely true. Again, this is one of the things that makes it a very complex area. And particularly for learning professionals, what that means is we really need to consider who our target audience are, what they're doing, whether or not they understand something, and what's the best way to present something. Because absolutely, there's more plasticity in the brain at an earlier age, which is why people perhaps for learning languages, they say if you've learned another language by the age of 5, you're a lot better at learning languages later in life. And that's because you're developing schemas at a very early age for language acquisition. And when you get later in life, it's harder for us to create those. Doesn't mean it's impossible. People can pick up and learn things at a later age, as we all know. People can change careers, they can go into education, learn a completely new skill. But when we say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, not completely true, but it becomes more challenging. So we need to find ways around that, clever ways of presenting information so that people can get through those limits in processing memory. So for example, I suffer from migraines, and the way my migraines present is that I get really confused and get my words back to front. Somebody's trying to teach me while I'm having a migraine. I'm not going to pick anything up. I'm not going to retain anything. My speech comes out back to front and I get my words confused. However, normally I'll be able to understand things relatively well. So that's just an example, yes, of how the working processing capacity can change even from day to day from different situations. So yes, that's absolutely a correct comment there. Okay, anything else yet? Do I think that capacity is affected by the level of engagement in the material? I would say probably not. I don't think it changes the capacity of your working memory, but what it does is means that you'll probably concentrate on it for a longer time and you'll actually work on that processing. You might slow down a little bit to think things through longer, and you might try harder at it. So in those ways, the level of engagement in the material can make a big difference. If it's something you're really interested in, you'll probably keep on thinking about it and think about it for a much longer period of time. Think about it later when you're in the shower or out walking the dog or eating your dinner, rather than just when you're sat there in front of the screen or in front of the presentation. So in that sense, yes, I think that the level of engagement makes a big difference, but it doesn't change the capacity of your working memory at a specific time. It just changes how long you're going to be engaged with something for, which if you've got a much longer time that you're using your working memory for, then absolutely you'll be able to process more. So that's where I think engagement comes in with that. So I think that was a really great question. And Alan, yes, I agree that the notion of constructs is very interesting because it's about the pattern of information. It's about the pattern of information. And again, that's where the analogy comes in. So the tube map absolutely isn't an accurate representation of reality. However, it's been presented in such a way that we can understand it a lot more easily. And you know, anybody who goes or works in London or visits London will use the tube map at some point. It's pretty easy to navigate, much more so than if you were having to look at a full map thinking, where the heck does that connect to? The distances on the tube map are not the same as the distances that you actually see on foot. So very much that kind of construct, and a map is a construct. That's really what we're looking at when we're looking at schemas. They're almost maps, as I said, these blueprints for our understanding, for us to recognize patterns. You know, if I close my eyes, I've got a pattern of the tube map in my head. Although I live in Nottingham, you can probably tell from my accent that I'm originally from the southeast, so I'm quite familiar with London. If I close my eyes, I can picture that tube map. I can map out a little pattern of where I need to go. But of course, if you've never seen that before, then that can be quite difficult. So Ian's comment there, if something is hard, then making sure you give a range of different constructs as part of instruction seems a sensible way to help the learner. So is this just scaffolding? Partly. What I'd say is the difference between scaffolding and constructs is that the construct is actually the mental thing that your brain is doing. So by scaffolding something, it's helping our brain actually create those constructs. So using lots of worked examples, using lots of case studies, things that people can actually work through. That is something that will really help you build those schemas in your mind. So help your mind do that. It does it naturally. It's been doing it since we were born. It will continue throughout our life. We'll be creating new schemas all the time. They're helped by us scaffolding information. However, they can be created without that. But of course, our job is to make it as easy as possible. And yes, absolutely, it is about understanding where the learner already is. How much do they already know? What schemas do they already have? What constructs do we need to help them create and help them build to understand how they can solve problems and work with things in the future? Okay, I'll move on now. Thanks ever so much for those questions. And again, any comments, please keep posting them. I'll pick them up as we go through. So there are two different things that we're going to look at now, the cognitive overload and cognitive underload. So we've looked quite a bit at cognitive overload. We need to make sure there isn't too much information, because if it is, you actually stop processing the information and your learning is diminished. There's a really interesting study that talks about this and provides a really good example. And that is that there were 3 sets of learners that were presented with the different information. One set of learners, a third of the learners, were presented with everything in a full course form. One set of the learners were presented as a course and then a short summary. And one set were just presented with that short summary. Now, when you look at that, you might think, okay, the people who will learn the most and will have the best recall are the people who will do the whole course and then look at the summary. In fact, that's not the case. Those people and the people who just saw the end summary did equally as well. The people who performed worst were the people who actually had to go through the whole course by itself and didn't get the summary. So that's something that's really interesting. And it makes you go back and say, well, actually, with that course, was there too much information? People clearly couldn't recall everything by the end of it. So really, what were they gaining from? And it looks like that actually that summary at the end was all that the learners needed. And that was the best way to get the information. Because when you compare the person who just got the summary and someone who did the whole course and the summary, they scored equally. The people who did the full course didn't do any better than the people who just got the end summary. And I think that's something really important for us when we're thinking about developing training programs, when we're thinking about education. Actually, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Does that person need that information? What does this further context really provide them with? Now, of course, again, we were looking at knowledge transfer in that analogy, in that experiment. So it was very much about knowledge transfer, less than actual application of knowledge. So when it comes to application of knowledge, we may well find that the reverse is true. And that's certainly what's postulated by John Sweller and other researchers in the area of cognitive load. But that's something we do need to bear in mind. If there's too much information, working memory processing does reach its limit and the learning is diminished. So it's not right necessarily to just present people with a full course if you don't give them the key information as well. Really, we need to see and distill the information down and say, well, what do people really need to know here? And that's something I do as an instructional designer. That's something I do on a daily basis. And also when working with learning solutions, when I go and analyze people's requirements for training solutions, I'll go through and my first thing is, well, of this information, what do people really need to know? What changes do they need to make? What behaviors do they need to exhibit? Or is in fact this an instance where people have expectations of quite a lot of material? Perhaps they're an academic audience and they're used to reading a lot of really dense information. And that's actually something that they enjoy and something that they find beneficial because they're curious, and they're those people who are motivated, who are engaged with the learning, who will keep on doing that work. So that's really something to think about very much. Now, of course, intuitively, you'd think that the less information that we give, the better. But that isn't true either. It's really about hitting that sweet spot. Cognitive underload can be absolutely as bad as cognitive overload. And again, that's when one of our challenges really is in the field of learning design. Frequently, when you're designing a course or when I'm designing a course, you'll have clients who say, okay, well, this is going out to an incredibly broad range of people with a very, very diverse range of abilities. So we need to make sure that everybody can understand and pass this. And I completely understand why they say that. Of course, it's important. Everybody needs to be able to go through it. But actually, what can happen in the worst situations is that learners actually lose existing knowledge and skills. That's known as expertise reversal, which is not something you want. You certainly don't want to be in a situation where your best learners and where the people who are, you know, the best performers generally are actually regressing because the challenge is too little. In fact, that challenge has gone, that there's no load there for them at all. They already know it. They're going through the motions. There's no challenge and their brain is in fact not engaged at all. And if that keeps on being, if they're presented with something that doesn't provide them with that load, then absolutely they can lose their skills. Again, this is something that was done with a study of chess players, for example. So the very basic level learners ended up doing better on some things than the highest level of chess players, because the highest level of chess players were presented with things that were too easy for them, and they essentially regressed in their skill level. They stopped doing as well as they could have done, whereas the lower learners were actually learning things and building those constructs. So it's really, really important that you match the pitch of your cognitive load to your learners. And so saying, yes, we need to teach to the lowest common denominator. I absolutely agree that everybody needs to be able to access the training and complete it, because of course everybody needs to have that opportunity. But what we need to think about as learning designers is how can we present things in different ways for different people, so we're not disadvantaging people who are either at the bottom or at the top. People in the middle are probably doing okay, because if it's too low a level, it's probably not by a significant enough amount, so the expertise reversal won't happen. However, if you're at the top, That's not true. Similarly, if you're teaching to the top, the people who are beginners, novices, they will be the ones who really struggle, whereas the intermediate learners, again, well, they'll have a bit of a challenge. They won't grasp it as quickly as the more advanced learners, but again, they're not going to be too overburdened. So again, hitting that sweet spot is really, really important. So as I've said here, this has critical implications for learning designers. Something very, very important. Something that Alan has said here. This is one of the reasons for the rise of popularity in infographics, because they provide useful summaries and their constructs. They enable pattern recognition using graphics with high visual impact and carefully selected information. Yes, that's absolutely true. And again, when we say a picture is worth 1,000 words, that can be very, very true. In many cases, a visual representation can be far better than producing that information. Okay, another example of how someone might regress. Okay, so if you imagine if somebody's actually in a work environment and they're undertaking various tasks, particularly repetitive tasks, it's important that those tasks don't become too repetitive, because essentially they move into sort of the automated variety. And then what can happen is if there are any changes, the learner can really struggle with those. So with the regression, they can actually lose the skills that they already have if they do things that are too easy for them. For example, I mean, I'll draw on my own example here of doing something I really enjoy, which is playing computer games. Now, there are various different levels of content that you can go through, things that are really challenging that you all need to work together to succeed in, and things that you can kind of just plow through really easily. Now, if somebody goes and just plows through things really easily for too long, they'll actually stop being able to take on that more challenging content. I mean, that's something I found with myself, and I found that with other people who've played with me. This is something that's been studied. Actually, again, if you do things that aren't challenging enough for you, your brain switches off and you actually start to lose the skills that you have, and you lose the recall that you have already. So it's very important. Somebody who's just been doing a repetitive task or something that's too easy for them over and over, which could easily be a course, perhaps they're being asked to answer a lot of multiple choice questions where they know the answer, they're starting to blank out, fade out, not read it properly. If they're then faced with something that's more of a challenge, they'll struggle with that in a way much more than they would have done had they not been presented with the really easy options first. Does that answer your question, Jill? Okay, great. So now moving on from what cognitive overload is and what cognitive underload is, now let's have a look at how we can manage the load. Yes, I can't give an example off the top of my head, but that's absolutely something we've got several studies of. Rebecca's just asked a question. Can you give an example of a study where skills regress after performing a repetitive, easy task? Yes, there are several studies about that. You should have my email address, my contact details. I can look those up afterwards. And yes, we get out of practice. That's one of the things that happens. But it's not just a case of getting out of practice. It's also a case of us kind of losing the things that we already knew. And it really, it isn't necessarily a case that by practicing it again, you'll regain the same level as quickly. You know, we always joke about, you know, riding a bike, you can get back on and do it. That's not necessarily the same with complex tasks and complex skills. When I look at things that I studied, say 20 years ago, and I look at them now, not only do I think I'm nowhere near that level, I used to play and teach music, no longer do I think, oh, I'm just not at that level anymore, but also think actually getting back to it now could be a real struggle. I'm not going to get back to that level without putting in an awful lot of effort. It's not just about being out of practice, but really my brain has gone to the point of, okay, this isn't information that's pertinent to me anymore. let's file it away so I don't have that recall. So that's one of the reasons why we really need to make sure that we're not doing things that are too easy and too low. We need to make sure that people don't get out of practice, don't forget the skills that they have. Okay, so moving on now to managing the load. As we mentioned earlier, everything has an intrinsic load. Difficult materials have a higher intrinsic load. Less difficult materials have a lower intrinsic load. The extraneous load is what we add on, and the germane load is important. We can create schemas which we can use in the long term. Novices don't have them, they need to build them, but we need to make sure we're controlling the extraneous load to create the absolute optimal learning game. So what increases extrinsic load? Now, sometimes extrinsic load is something we want to increase. That's quite important. But generally, we do want to lower it. So there are different ways in which we can go through and do this. So to increase it, wordiness. If you just keep talking and talking and talking, kind of like I'm doing now, and use complex language, your sentences are far too long, you've got the kind of constructions that 19th century philosophers would put together, but it's half a page of text just separated with semicolons, and that's just one sentence. That's far too long. That increases your extrinsic load. Any big blocks of text that aren't broken up either, you know, just simply by a paragraph break, but more importantly, awesome academic papers. Absolutely true. So reading big blocks of text, that can be very, very challenging. And obviously, as I was saying, I am working towards a PhD at the moment. And so I read a lot of academic papers. And there is a real difference in readability between them. And some things I find really challenging, not because necessarily the content is challenging, but because they've been written in such a way that the message is completely obscured behind a whole load of text. Really complex language that doesn't need to be as complex as they're making it. Really long sentences that could be shorter, and blocks of text that can easily be broken up with graphics, with graphs, with information, different page layouts. Another thing which can be really very important when we're looking particularly at e-learning is looking at distracting elements on a page or in audio. Now, many of us will have clients who will require full audio narration for a course, where they'll want everything that appears visually on screen, they'll want an audio file that produces exactly the same information. This is bad. This significantly increases the extrinsic load because our information processing processes reading words and listening to words as part of the same channel. So actually, if you've got those two things absolutely matching together, then your brain can find that far too hard to process because they're both linguistic. Now, that's not the case where you have words in audio and a diagram or something visual. And so when you're looking at things like that, making sure you've got mismatched elements, don't have them identical. Don't have a block of text where you read out exactly the same block of text, but actually say, well, is this something I can summarize in a few key words? Is this something where in fact it would be better for me to have an illustration on the page? Problem solving introduced too early. That could be a real challenge. Now, some of us, I'm quite keen on this, actually, is asking questions right up front before you've actually taught. So very much a sort of ask or test to teach idea where people are asked to think about things. That's fine for one-off questions. But actually, if you're looking at presenting something quite challenging, then that problem solving might be introduced too early. If the novices don't have the schemas to actually solve those problems, because of course I like practical learning, putting things into context, so using case studies, using scenarios that learners have to work through is a really good way to get people to learn. They're engaging their brain, they're engaging their different processes. So, you know, it can be very interesting to put those in, but you need to make sure you don't do it before novices have the schemas that they're available to you. Now, I've got a question here. Can captions on video actually become a challenge? Yes, they can be. That's absolutely true. it really depends on the person and their ability to process information. So it's very, very important. Yes, one of the comments, offer options for one or the other because of accessibility. So some people may need audio or captions, and that's absolutely true. So for accessibility reasons, it should always be provided as an option. Nothing that's provided just in audio should be available without captions or a transcript. So generally, it should be a request. If you want the audio to play because you need that for accessibility reasons, then absolutely that should be something you can select. But otherwise, making sure that those two channels don't go through at the same time is really quite important. Of course, people who do need to use subtitles will do. I sometimes have hearing problems and therefore sometimes do require subtitles myself. So I know absolutely that it's something you can need at times, and I frustrate people around me. And my husband, for example, doesn't want to have subtitles on when he's watching a TV show or film. Whereas for me, sometimes that can be quite important to actually allow me to understand what people are saying. So that is absolutely a consideration. So seeing text subtitles can be beneficial. Yes, that's very, very true, having that. So I certainly don't want to say no subtitles, you can't have audio, you can't do this, can't do that. It's very much about taking the context and providing the learner with some level of control over this. Giving control to the learner is one of the most important things. So Alan's made a comment that it's important to provide a psychological hook to engage managers to read reports. It's absolutely true that yes, you need to make sure that people don't just throw things because it's too wordy. People do need to have that key information presented to them. And coming back to what I said earlier, if you provide that information in a summarized form, it can be just as good as providing the whole thing, depending on how it's being written. Okay, so another interesting question. Does text that is an accurate précis of the audio enhance learning, and what does it do for cognitive load? Right, now, again, this is a really good question, and actually it can be really good. An accurate précis of the audio can absolutely enhance learning, because what's that doing? First of all, it's providing repetition, but in a different way, so you're not listening to and reading the same thing over and over again. It also forces you to go more slowly, because you can't take in both at the same time. You need to listen to one and then read the text, or vice versa, read the text and then listen to the audio. And again, that's something that can be very good. It's got that repeated information, but it's not identical. So absolutely, I would recommend that. If you have got audio, try and do that so that the text on screen and the text in the audio is not identical. Making sure that one or the other covers the important information. That's what's very important. Again, with going at the pace of the audio, it depends. I personally prefer to read because, as Joan has just mentioned, we can read faster than a speaker can voice the text. I'm a very fast reader. Listening is more challenging for me. As I've said, I sometimes need subtitles on. So I find listening a lot more difficult than I do reading. So for me, having audio on tends to not be great. It's distracting and I can't always understand it. And so for me, being able to turn off audio is very important. However, there are always examples in which having audio that's very clear, very concise, that can work really, really well. And again, making sure that you have control over that. So you're not forced to go at the pace of the audio, and it's not necessarily the dominant medium. It, again, really depends on what you're doing and who you're working with. So perhaps if you're working with a group that have lower educational attainment, or perhaps you're working with younger people, then in those cases, it may well be that audio is a better dominant medium. It may be that perhaps people don't have as high a level of literacy. Perhaps English isn't their first language. It may be a secondary language for them. In those cases, audio can be very helpful because people can generally understand audio more than they may be able to read the language on screen. Or again, if somebody has dyslexia or other learning difficulties, then that can again be quite important to them. So it's very, very, very important to make sure that you balance those things and really give the learner control and think about who you're designing for. So yes, that's a good comment from Kevin, is speed controls on audio. And why aren't we just reading this webinar then? Absolutely. I mean, it is one of those questions. As I said, we've got a paper that goes with this. So in fact, if that's a better medium for you, you can go and you can download the paper, you can get all the information, everything I've talked about, and research it yourself. The issue there is, of course, with one of the issues there is, of course, if it's written down, there are no responses to any of your questions. You're just having to read what's on the screen. Of course, in a live event, then you do get to actually interact with me and interact with people. So I'd say that's the primary benefit. There's a little bit of back and forth going there. But it's absolutely true. I'm one of the people who does like reading. But I think it really is different strokes for different folks. What works for one doesn't work for another, and understanding who you're working with. So it's really understanding what works best for you. Okay, so we've gone through quite a lot of this. So one of the other things that increases extrinsic load, poor presentation, loads of stuff on the screen, things all over the place, not great. That could be something that could be really challenging. Perhaps you've got words, bad kerning, things are laid out poorly. It's not a logical order for your brain to work through. That increases extrinsic load. So to reduce it, you want clear presentation, simple languages, and use a lot of worked examples or case studies before you introduce problem solving. And those things will reduce your intrinsic load, if that's what you're aiming to do. So yes, absolutely. If you want to reduce the extrinsic load, make it really clear and don't add distracting elements. But if you want to increase the extrinsic load, which you may want to do in some examples, you can make things more complicated. You can introduce those worked examples early. You can introduce case studies and problem solving at a much earlier stage, and you can repeat that information. There's another really interesting study actually about extrinsic load, which dealt with cognitive underload, and that was where the learners who were already pretty proficient were not gaining that very much. We're not gaining very much from reading a pretty simple, straightforward translation of some text. And in the study, they found that actually increasing the complexity of the paragraph actually made things more, by increasing the extrinsic load, that made things work better for these learners. Actually, they retained more and they performed better at the end with the more complex, wordier, poorly presented information. And that's because they were already pretty good at things and they needed that boost of extrinsic load. So even though it was exactly the same material, for them it had quite a low intrinsic load, and they needed that boost to a higher load for it actually to challenge them sufficiently. And again, with the name of the study, again, if you contact me afterwards, I will have some, I've got some good references that I'll be able to provide you there. Yes, I don't have them all within this, but I've got some good references going on the white paper. Okay. So moving on, expertise reversal. This is really what I've been talking about throughout. You need to know your audience. Don't make experts complete that basic level training. I know we all get asked to do it. I know that. But if you have control, don't do it. Make sure that people are only forced to do things that are actually at the level that they really need to. For one thing, you know, it builds a lot of goodwill. People aren't forced to do things that are far below their level. Now, of course, I know it isn't always possible. It isn't always possible for me, and I'm sure it won't always be possible for you. But essentially, where you can, don't make them do it. one of the ways in which, well, a couple of the ways in which you can get around this are by starting with a diagnostic assessment and including profiling for learners. So if somebody starts out with a diagnostic assessment, they can complete questions at the start, and then you can find out what's the targeted information that they need to know, what's most important for them. That means they can skip topics they already know and focus on those they don't know. So that's a good way of doing it. And also profiling according to role and expertise, rather than just saying everybody has to do this from start to finish, the same course. So that's a good way to prevent expertise reversal. It's by, again, making sure that things are targeted. So your lowest level learners, your novices, your beginners, people who are new to a role, new to a subject, they are able to take things at the more basic level. And people who already know what they're doing, that's refresher training, are able to say, well, actually, I know all this stuff. I can demonstrate that I know it. Let's move to more challenging areas. So a quick summary here is just to quickly wrap it up, because I realise I've been waffling on for nearly an hour now. I was saying to Joan earlier, I'll be nowhere near that long. I may have underestimated how long I can talk for, but also I'd like to say thank you for your great questions going through. So just the high level things is cognitive load, what it is, it's the burden of things on our working memory. So you don't need to think about what we've got that are already processed and already set away in our brain, but it's what we've got that's working memory. Cognitive overload causes learning gain to drop, but so does cognitive underload. So we really need to hit that sweet spot in the middle. Don't overload learners and don't underload learners. We need to do that by managing the extraneous load. That's the bit that we can control. That's not the intrinsic load, which, as we've discussed earlier, can be different for different people. So if somebody's a complete novice and new to something, the intrinsic load for new material could be much higher than for somebody who's already built up those schemas. So know your learners. I mean, that's, of course, something that's absolutely fundamental, and I'm sure everybody is already doing this, and everybody already is very aware that knowing your learners is absolutely essential. What is their expertise level? How can we tailor the training to fit them? So avoiding that one-size-fits-all solution, because then that can prevent the overload and it can prevent the underload, and you can pitch that just right. Okay, so finally, are there any other questions? I'm just looking at timing.
Lucy, that's great. While we wait for questions to come in, I've got a thought, which is that, I mean, if you look back at traditional e-learning in particular, there was a sense that it was just page turning. And
Absolutely.
Sometimes when you have subject matter experts, they just really want you to put so much in.
Oh, that's absolutely true.
What are your tactics for, dealing with over-wordy subject matter experts?
I mean, it is a constant challenge, and it's something I always talk about up front. And I will say, you are the subject matter experts. You are experts. You know more than me. You know more than the learners, far more. These can be people with 25 years of experience trying to give me the information to create a 30-minute course for beginners. Now, of course, that's a massive mismatch of information. So really what I come down to is working with learning objectives. What do people need to be able to do, learn, or know in a practical way by the end of this piece of training? And that's what we have to stick through. So any piece of content that comes through, I essentially will map it against what any of the objectives are. And the question is, if it doesn't meet one of those objectives, why is it in there? That's always the question. Why have you put it in? It doesn't help them in this way. Now, it could be good background information, or it could be useful material for a different course. It could be you say, actually, okay, we'll have this basic information, but let's move on and say this further information is better for people at a higher level and people who are interested. Let's provide that as additional information, but it shouldn't go in the main course. So that's generally, I'm pretty strict about this. If a subject matter expert comes to me and says we need this in, I always have to ask why.
And I suppose the other thing that comes to mind for me is there is a temptation sometimes to pack your e-learning with information, and you end up doing knowledge transfer.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a lot more challenging, isn't it, and interesting and engaging if you can actually focus on behaviours and attitudes and stuff like that.
Absolutely, and that's again where we get the case studies and worked examples, moving on to actually putting things into practice. That's one of the best ways to learn anything, even knowledge transfer. actually putting that knowledge into practice. Where will you need to know that? What level of recall do you need? So very much that's something that we should be looking at and considering at every time for every course. And very much anything that's just page turning e-learning, not great.
Not great, no.
So yes, looking at ways to engage, to motivate as well, which obviously were mentioned by some of the commenters earlier. But yes, looking at what we do and really using this to go back and give this as feedback to people and say, well, okay, you've asked me to do this, but this is how our brains work. This is how we process information. This is how we learn things. Let's look at ways in which we can do things differently, that we can do things to challenge people. So, for example, using serious games, not necessarily just gamification, but branching scenarios, looking at how people can put things into practice, but perhaps interactive videos where people look at a behavior, are asked to rate it, things like that. So I think that's something that's really important. So yes, that's my comment there.
Well, I hope you're reading the feedback, because already, although I've launched the poll, we're already getting some great comments in the chat. So it's been, I think it's been, 85% have already said it's been useful. So
oh, excellent.
86% now. So.
Oh, and I'd just like to say thank you all ever so much for sitting and bearing with me and listening to me talk about this. It's something I am very interested in. So if you want to...
Shall I put your email in the chat?
Yes, if you put my email in the chat, that would be fantastic. So if anybody wants to email me personally about this with more questions and who'd like further information and links to some useful resources, then that can be really good and really useful.
That's in there now.
Yeah, absolutely. So please email me if you've got some questions, and if you want to know more about some studies. I've got a big long reading list of about 30 or so books and papers that I can send over to you that'll sort of back up and give some information to the information I've given you today. Okay. And of course I'd say that with cognitive load theory, now there are questions about it. It's not fully, it's one of those things that some people say, actually, this is really great. And there are some people who've got questions about it. And I agree with some of those questions. I haven't had time today to go into that in more detail. But again, that's something I'm quite happy to share with people at a later date with areas that perhaps we want to challenge in cognitive load theory.
So yes, for everybody who's listening still, we are recording, and I'll email out a link. Most people have said they're happy to be added to our mailing lists, but if you're not, I'm not sure I'll see who you are from the poll results, so please do let me know individually. I'll put my email in as well, and then also I can strip you out of the chat if that is necessary as well, but otherwise I'm recording the chat as well, and I'm trying to speak while I'm typing, which is not so easy. I think all that remains really for me to say is a big thank you to Lucy and to Walkgrove, who, as you probably are aware, have lent us this Zoom platform. Thank you for filling in the polls. That's very useful stuff. And as Lucy says, please feel free to email her or email me, and I can pass it on. And I think we're just about done, Lucy. So thanks again.
Okay, well, thank you all ever so much, and hope that you really enjoy the rest of your day.